Today, we bring you a story revolving around Chloe, a woman who is secretly having an affair with Joe, despite being married to Alan. What will happen next? Let's dive deep into today's story to find out. If you find this interesting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any new updates. Now, let's get started. In a cozy, dimly lit restaurant filled with the smooth sound of jazz, Chloe settled at a table in a private corner, her expression a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The intimate ambience suited her purpose well, a quiet, clandestine meeting away from the familiar eyes of her life with Alan. She anxiously glanced at the entrance as she waited for Joe, her companion for the evening. In her early 30s, Chloe was elegant and poised, her polished demeanor matched only by the subtle thrill in her eyes. Joe, a casual, confident man with an easy charm, appeared just as invested in their meeting as she was, hinting at an intimate bond they both attempted to keep hidden. As she awaited Joe's return from the restroom, her phone buzzed unexpectedly. Startled, she checked the screen, her heart skipping when she saw Alan's name appear. She quickly answered, attempting to keep her tone light and unconcerned. "Hi, honey. How's work going?" Chloe chirped, trying to sound sweet and nonchalant. There was a pause before Alan responded, his voice steady but laced with a hint of suspicion. "Oh, work's interesting. Where are you right now?" Chloe forced a laugh, trying to steady her nerves. "Oh, just catching up with some friends from the conservatory. Nothing exciting, really." She hoped the explanation would satisfy him, giving her a moment to refocus. But Alan's next word sent a chill down her spine. "Turn around, Chloe." His tone was calm, but the coldness in it was unmistakable. Heart-pounding, she slowly turned, her gaze landing on Alan seated in the shadows across the room, accompanied by a composed woman she recognized as Jessica, his lawyer. The sight of them both sent a wave of panic through her. She had been caught in the act, and there was no easy way out. Determined to keep her composure, Chloe made her way to their table, forcing a polite smile. "What's going on, honey? Why are you here with a lawyer?" Alan returned her smile, though his eyes were tense and cold. "Just here to observe," he said, voice smooth but edged. "Tell me, Chloe, who's Joe?" Her heart skipped again, but Chloe managed a dismissive laugh, attempting to brush off his inquiry. "Joe's just a friend from the conservatory, a brilliant pianist. We were talking about music, that's all." Alan leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Really? Interesting choice of words. Tell me, would he describe it the same way?" As Chloe approached Alan's table, she felt her pulse quicken, struggling to mask her unease with a smile. Jessica, Alan's lawyer, sat quietly beside him, her gaze detached but observant. The situation's gravity was beginning to sink in for Chloe, and she realized she'd need to choose her words carefully. Clearing her throat, she spoke with forced politeness. "What's going on, honey? Why are you here with a lawyer?" Alan smiled, but the warmth she was used to seeing in his eyes was absent. Instead, his expression was tight, and his voice carried a biting edge. "Oh, just here to observe. I thought it'd be enlightening to catch up with my wife," he replied smoothly, his tone measured. "Now, tell me, Chloe, who's Joe?" A flicker of panic crossed her face, but she quickly laughed, hoping to steer the conversation into lighter waters. "Joe? He's just a friend from the conservatory, a brilliant pianist. We were talking about music, that's all," she answered, trying to sound casual. But Alan was unmoved. He leaned in slightly, his gaze intense and unyielding. "Really?" he said, his tone hard. "Interesting choice of words. Tell me, would he describe it the same way?" Chloe felt her heart race, but she held on to her composure, laughing softly. "Alan, this is ridiculous. You're overreacting," she replied, glancing at Jessica, who remained expressionless but clearly attentive to every word. Without another word, Alan pulled out his phone, pressing play on a recording that began with a voice Chloe instantly recognized as Joe's. "If I'm not careful, she might break me. She's quite the wild one." Joe's voice, playful yet tinged with flirtation, echoed through the speaker, leaving Chloe momentarily speechless. She stammered, desperately searching for an explanation. "Alan, you can't be serious. This is out of context. Joe was just bragging. It means nothing." Jessica finally spoke, her voice cool and professional. "People do say all sorts of things," she observed, her gaze steady on Chloe. "But in my line of work, evidence speaks volumes." Chloe's mind raced, and she could feel her grip on the situation slipping. Alan studied her, his expression unreadable. "So you're saying Joe's lying?" he asked, testing her with every word. "What would he say if you were here right now?" Chloe forced another laugh, though it came out strained. Joe would clear this up. Obviously, she replied, a hint of desperation in her voice. He'll tell you the same thing I just did. But inwardly, she feared Joe's reaction if he'd back her up or only make things worse. Just then, Joe emerged from the restroom, looking slightly disheveled and visibly irritated. He glanced at Chloe, unaware of the confrontation taking place but clearly annoyed. "Chloe, someone locked me in the restroom," he exclaimed, his voice loud enough to turn a few heads in the restaurant. Alan's smile turned cold. "Ah, Joe, perfect timing," he said smoothly, gesturing towards Chloe. "Meet my wife, Chloe. I believe she has something to explain to you." Realizing the setup, Joe's eyes widened, and his confidence crumbled as he grasped the severity of the situation. He stumbled, attempting to gather his composure but failing miserably. I think I left something at my table. I should go check on that," he stammered, clearly desperate to escape. Without waiting for Chloe's response, Joe turned and hurried out of the restaurant, leaving her alone, humiliated and exposed. As Joe disappeared from sight, Chloe's heart raced, and her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger. Alan's unflinching gaze remained fixed on her, his calm exterior only heightening the tension. With Jessica still quietly observing, the weight of the situation pressed down on Chloe, leaving her scrambling for a way to regain control. Alan's phone buzzed, breaking the uncomfortable silence. He glanced at the screen, then met Chloe's gaze with a look of calculated satisfaction. Holding the phone up, he pressed play on another, recording a snippet of a conversation between himself and Joe that Chloe hadn't anticipated. Joe's voice echoed through the restaurant speakers, sounding cocky yet nervous, as he half joked, "If I'm not careful, she might break me. She's quite the wild one." The words hung in the air, amplifying Chloe's growing sense of dread. Chloe tried to maintain her composure, but a subtle tremor betrayed her. "Alan," she began, forcing a laugh that felt hollow even to her. "You know, Joe, he was just being dramatic. You can't seriously think this is real." Her words came out shakier than she intended, but she pressed on, hoping to deflect. He was just trying to impress someone. Men do that sometimes. If you find it interesting, please give me a like and comment to let me know how you feel about today's story. Alan's gaze remained unyielding, his voice cold. "Is that so?" he replied, arching an eyebrow. "Interesting, because it seems he was rather candid. Are you saying he's lying, then?" Chloe felt herself slipping as she struggled to keep her story straight. She glanced over at Jessica, who watched her with an unwavering gaze. Jessica's silence felt more piercing than any direct accusation. "People say things they don't mean all the time, right?" Chloe said, her voice almost pleading. "Joe wouldn't take this seriously. He'd laugh if he were here right now." Jessica finally spoke up, her tone neutral yet firm. "In my experience, people may joke, but intentions have a way of surfacing eventually," she said coolly, her words landing with an undeniable weight. "And in cases like this, intentions are rarely meaningless." Alan tilted his head slightly, assessing her reaction. "Chloe, this could all be a misunderstanding," he continued, though his words held a tinge of irony. "But somehow I doubt that. So let me ask again, who exactly is Joe to you?" Chloe's mind raced for a response, but any semblance of control she'd clung to was slipping. The facade she'd worked so hard to maintain was crumbling under Alan's relentless questioning. Her attempt at an answer faltered, and she could sense Alan's disappointment sharpening. She realized there was no easy way out of this. Just then, the waiter approached with the bill, and Alan reached for his wallet. But instead of paying, he handed it directly to Chloe, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "I think it's only fair that you handle your portion tonight," he said, his voice laced with a thinly veiled contempt. "You and Joe were here together after all." Caught off guard, Chloe took the bill with a stunned expression. "Alan, are you really doing this?" she demanded, her voice rising in frustration. "After all this, you're just going to leave me here?" Alan's smile was chillingly calm as he stood up. "I'm sure you'll figure it out," he replied, voice cold but steady. "After all, resourcefulness is one of your strongest qualities, isn't it?" With a final nod to Jessica, Alan turned and walked away, leaving Chloe alone at the table, her mind spinning with disbelief and anger. As she watched him exit, she felt the weight of her actions and the humiliation settling in, realizing just how dire her situation had become. As Chloe sat alone, the weight of Alan's accusations pressing down on her, she struggled to compose herself. The restaurant seemed colder, and every glance from nearby patrons felt like a judgment. Her mind raced with thoughts of retaliation, explanations, anything that might salvage her situation. But before she could devise a plan, her eyes landed on Joe, who was hurrying back towards the table, clearly shaken from his encounter with Alan. Joe approached with visible frustration, his movements tense. "Chloe," he hissed, "what's going on?" "Someone locked me in the restroom, and now this." He gestured toward the restaurant, as though the place itself were complicit in his discomfort. His voice was sharper than usual, clearly oblivious to the full gravity of the situation he was walking into. Alan, who had only taken a few steps toward the door, paused, hearing Joe's voice, and turned back with an almost satisfied smirk. "Ah, Joe, perfect timing," he said, his tone dripping with irony. "I believe you haven't had the pleasure of meeting my wife, Chloe." Alan's words were calm, almost too calm, like a trap waiting to spring. Realization dawned on Joe's face as his eyes darted from Alan to Chloe, piecing together the painful truth. He stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, an exit plan, anything to escape the scrutiny he had unwittingly walked back into. I think I left something at my table," he mumbled, voice trembling. "I should go check on that." But Alan wasn't going to let him slip away that easily. He blocked Joe's path with a subtle yet firm move, the satisfaction in his eyes unmistakable. "Oh, please stay," Alan insisted smoothly, his smile barely hiding his contempt. "We'd love to hear more about this friendship you and my wife share. After all, you two seemed so comfortable earlier. I'm sure you have nothing to hide." Joe looked helplessly at Chloe, his face flushed with embarrassment, and she could see his fear of Alan's wrath growing with each passing second. He turned to her with pleading eyes, but she was as lost for words as he was. Her desperation to escape the situation had left her paralyzed, exposed in the harshest way possible. Just then, Jessica stepped in, her voice calm but carrying a heavy finality. "Mr. Harper," she addressed Joe, emphasizing Alan's formal title. "It's clear there's been a breach of trust here, and for matters like this, legal action isn't out of the question." Her gaze was steely, making it evident she was more than just an observer. Chloe's heart sank further, and Joe, visibly panicked, made a feeble attempt to recover. "Look, I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he stammered, looking away. This wasn't serious, okay? It was just a fling." Alan's smile widened, his satisfaction unmistakable. "A fling, is it?" he said quietly, turning back to Chloe. "So that's what you've risked everything for." The humiliation was overwhelming. Chloe's facade had crumbled entirely, and Joe, in a final act of self-preservation, fled the restaurant, leaving her to face the consequences alone. Alan's gaze held her for a moment longer, filled with a coldness she had never seen before he finally turned and left her there, stranded in her shame. As Alan exited, Chloe sat frozen, her mind reeling from the public unmasking. The whispers and curious glances from other diners around her felt like daggers, piercing her last fragments of composure. She clutched her purse, desperate to regain any semblance of control, but her hands shook as she fumbled to pay the bill. A wave of embarrassment washed over her when her card was declined. Alan had anticipated this moment, cutting off her financial access with precision. The waiter politely cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable as Chloe's face, flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. She forced herself to stand, finally managing to pay with cash, though it left her feeling both foolish and exposed. As she stepped outside, the cold night air stung her face, grounding her in the stark reality of what had just transpired. She hastily hailed a cab, longing to escape the scene, yet the suffocating weight of what lay ahead only intensified. The ride home felt endless, and her mind swirled with a mix of anger at Alan, resentment towards Joe, and above all, a deep sense of regret at her own actions that had led to this. When she arrived home, Alan was waiting in the dimly lit living room, his expression calm yet hardened. Chloe threw her purse onto the table, her frustration erupting as she confronted him. "You humiliated me, Alan," she hissed, her voice rising. "In front of everyone. How dare you?" Alan met her outburst with a chilling stare, his tone devoid of any warmth. "Humiliation?" he replied, his voice steady and unyielding. "Perhaps you should consider that this is exactly what I felt when I discovered what you've been doing behind my back. This isn't revenge, Chloe. This is reality." The words cut deeper than she expected, stripping away her defenses. She wanted to argue, to blame him somehow, but the calm finality in his voice silenced her. Her anger waned, leaving a hollow feeling in its place, as Alan reached for an envelope on the coffee table. Without another word, he handed it to her. Chloe's hands trembled as she took it, recognizing it immediately. Divorce papers, prepared and waiting, with Jessica's meticulous work evident in every detail. Alan's gaze softened for a moment, though his eyes still held a trace of the pain she'd inflicted. "It's over, Chloe," he said quietly, almost regretfully. "There's nothing left to fight for." Chloe swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "Alan, can't we work through this? You can't just throw it all away." But he shook his head, his expression resolute. "It was you who threw it away, Chloe. I'm only making it official." With that, Alan turned and left the room, leaving her alone with the papers and the suffocating silence. In that moment, Chloe realized that her actions had cost her more than she'd anticipated. She was left to face the emptiness she had created, with nothing but regret and the shattered remnants of her life. In the weeks following that fateful night, Chloe's life unraveled piece by piece. The once familiar comforts of her home now felt cold and foreign as she packed her belongings, each item a reminder of what she had lost. Alan had moved quickly, filing the divorce papers that Jessica had meticulously prepared. His efficiency left Chloe feeling as though she were just a lingering shadow in his life, something he'd already moved beyond. Their court date arrived swiftly, and Chloe sat across from Alan in the courtroom, feeling more vulnerable than ever. She'd planned to argue that he was overreacting, hoping to paint a picture of Alan as cold and unyielding. But her plan crumbled as Alan methodically presented evidence, a collection of texts, emails, and witness accounts that left no room for doubt. A neighbor even took the stand, describing the nights Chloe had been absent, adding a layer of quiet condemnation that made her wince. Her attempts to defend herself came across as hollow, her words lacking substance against the weight of Alan's carefully presented case. As the judge signed the decree, the finality of it all hit Chloe. She'd entered the courtroom with some lingering hope that Alan might soften, but now she understood that he was resolute. The decision was made, and there was no turning back. The quiet despair that had built up over the past weeks became a constant companion, following her as she walked out of the courtroom, her once confident steps reduced to an aimless shuffle. A few days later, Chloe attempted one last time to speak to Alan, hoping to rekindle some spark of forgiveness or understanding. She found him at their former home, his expression unreadable as she approached him with pleading eyes. "Alan," she whispered, her voice fragile, "we had something special. Don't throw it all away. Please, just give me one more chance." Alan's gaze was steady but distant, a look that held no hint of reconciliation. "Special?" he echoed, the faintest trace of bitterness in his voice. "That's what I thought too. But whatever, we had ended the moment you decided to betray it. This isn't something I can forgive, Chloe." His words left no room for argument, and as he turned and walked away, Chloe felt a profound emptiness settle over her. She was alone, left with the weight of her choices and the realization that the life she had once taken for granted was now beyond repair. In the months that followed, she attempted to rebuild, though the process was slow and fraught with the consequences of her actions. Friends drifted away, unwilling to involve themselves in the fallout, and the life of social engagements and luxury that she'd grown accustomed to vanished, leaving her in a far simpler existence. Alone in her small, rented apartment, Chloe had ample time to reflect on the choices that had led her here, each day a reminder of what she had sacrificed for fleeting excitement. She had lost everything she once held dear, left only with the knowledge that forgiveness would never come.